Moses runs away because he's murdered somebody, and then he goes to Reuel. And Reuel means friend of Elohim, friend of God. So this Reuel has the same title as Abram does, because we know that this Reuel actually has the name Jethro. And this means that Moses probably learned from him how to hear the voice, how to obey it, and how to have it counted to him as righteousness. Because up to this stage, or until just before he killed the man, he actually was part of the royal household of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was actually his half-brother or his sort of brother. Okay, so then the whole history then unfolds, and he married Zipporah, and Zipporah means the little bird. Then the first very significant thing that happens to Moses is at the burning bush. The translation that I use here is the Complete Jewish Bible, which is a translation that has the Hebrew background of everything in mind. It says that when Moses was tending the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of Elohim, to Horeb. The angel of Adonai appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of the bush. He looked and saw, although the bush was flaming with fire, yet the bush was not being burned up. Moshe said, I'm going to go over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burnt up. When Yudevave saw that he had gone over to see, Elohim called to him from the middle of the bush, Moshe, Moshe, he answered, here I am. A couple of very interesting things are written here. The first is, obviously, as a shepherd, it was Moses' task to go and look for a place to take care of his father-in-law Jethro's sheep. And this led him into a private space. When he came into the private space, the angel of Adonai appeared to him. When we look at this, it actually says the angel of Adonai appeared to him, and then it says Elohim, God, called to him from the middle of the bush. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh called from the middle of the bush, which actually means that the angel of Adonai, the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh self. And this also implies that the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh must be Yeshua, because no one has seen the Father. Who has seen the Son has seen the Father. And this says a lot about who the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was right from the beginning, because we know that Yeshua pre-existed creation and was there right from the beginning. He comes and he presents himself in the middle of the bush, and the bush is flaming with fire, but it does not burn up. This has the implication that fire will burn everything sinful, and whatever is not sinful cannot be burned. So the angel in the bush, and therefore the bush itself, could not be burned because there was no sin there. And when Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh saw that he had gone over to see, he called from the middle of the bush. And then Moshe answers and he says, here I am. So in the middle of the bush, we have Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, I am. And he calls to I am. There is I am and I am, which is the creator and creation talking to each other from the burning bush. And this is exactly what we have just discussed, that Moses seeks the pastures, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh takes him into private space, and the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appears, and then Elohim calls from the bush. Nobody has seen the Father but the Son. Who's seen the Son has seen the Father. So it takes some thinking who was in the middle of the bush. Elohim, God, displays his sinlessness and righteousness. Heavenly fire consumes sin. And then there are these two, I am and I am, creator and creation. He said, don't come closer, take your sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. Why does he have to take off his sandals if he is standing on holy ground? He is standing on holy ground because he's in the presence of the holy God. And the holy God wants no distance between him and his creature, and therefore his creature had to take off his shoes so that he was in contact with the holy ground, and therefore in the contact with the God of the holy creation. And he says, I am the God of your father. He continued, the God of Avram, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov. He says that he's the God of Amram, but also of Avram, of Yitzchak, and of Yaakov. So there is this thing that he is saying, that I am not the God of your father, the way that the God of the father of Pharaoh is the Pharaoh who is deceased. I am the God of your father, but I'm also the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So that you can see that your father has died. Abraham has died, Isaac has died, Jacob has died, and you're not to worship them, you are to worship me. Moshe covered his face because he was afraid to look at Elohim. Adonai said, I have now seen how my people are being oppressed in Egypt and heard their cry for release from their slave masters, because I know their pain. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that country to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaani, the Hitti, the Emori, the Perizi, the Hivi, and the Yevusi, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Yevusites. So it's exactly the same land that was promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So he's actually coming and he's in the burning bush, actually in the burning bush in the same way as he was in the smoking pot that moved between the halves of the carcass when he made his covenant with Abraham. And therefore, he's by being fire and smoke in the midst of that bush, he's alluding to the fact that he's now acting in terms of the covenant that he has with Isaac, with Abraham, Isaac, and also with Jacob. So he's the Elohim of the ancestors, and it is the presence of Elohim himself. Now, Elohim is actually presence in the eternal dimension, which is day one of creation, which is also the most holy. Stefan, just for your information, the scriptures speak about, in the Hebrew, they speak about day one of creation, and then the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day, and the seventh day. Ancient Hebrew scholars said that the reason that that was true is because day one is eternity. It is ring-fenced by the Most Holy, and there is no time and no space in it, and that is why the presence of God can be there, why the Shekhinah can be in the Most Holy, because there is no time and no space, and because it is eternal and eternity exists there. So when Moses meets with the Holy One, he's actually meeting with him by manner of speaking in eternity, because he's demonstrating himself to him. So he's repeating the promise of Abraham with the smoking pot and the burning torch that was part of that promise that he had made. Yes, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen how terribly the Egyptians oppressed them. Therefore, now come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you can lead my people, the descendants of Israel, out of Egypt. Now here's Moses, and now Pharaoh is sort of his brother because he grew up with him, and now he has to go back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is looking for him because he killed an Egyptian. And Moshe said to Elohim, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? He replied, I will surely be with you. Your sign that I have sent you will be that you have led the people out of Egypt. You will worship Elohim God on this mountain. Moshe said to God, look, when I appear before the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask you, what is his name? What am I to tell them? God said to Moses, Yeh Asher Yeh. I am and will be what I am. And added, here is what I have to say to the people of Israel. Yeh has sent me to you. So God is actually not mentioning his own name here. He's mentioning the words from which his name is derived, which are Yeh Asher Yeh. Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh. So Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh himself sends him back to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, whose God is the Pharaoh who has died. So he then went to lead the people out of Israel out of Egypt. And then the sign was a sign that was to appear in the future. The sign that Moses really received was the sign of the covenant with Abraham, because it was a sign of the smoking pot and the flaming torch. So here he says, I am has sent me to you. So in this way, he then identifies himself accurately and tells Moses what he is to do. So Moses considers himself unworthy. He's humble because he's from Pharaoh's palace. But then what now happens is that he had heard the voice in an audible way and in an externalized way. But he would not have come to this place if he had not learned to live as did Reuel, the friend of Elohim, Abraham, and also Jethro, his father-in-law. And that voice inside him is the Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, who is Messiah in him. And it was Messiah in him who would be opposing Pharaoh. Messiah who also is Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh. Now, when Yeshua is in the Garden of Gethsemane, the guards fall over because they say, are you? And he says, I am, and they fall over. So he could not have said the usual Hebrew ani, which says I am, but he must have said Heyeh. And maybe he said Heyeh Asher Heyeh. For the temple guards were certainly Jewish and would have known what these words mean, and that they are the words with which Moshe was sent to Israel. So it is actually Yeshua sending Moses to Israel, and this means that he then extracts Israel from Egypt in terms of what he accomplished at the cross. Moses' sign follows on his work. It says that he would win Pharaoh over. Yes, it was a Red Sea crossing, but he probably crossed the Reed Sea. And the purpose was for praise and worship on the mountain.
Would it be fair to say this was Moses' Damascus encounter? That the man before the burning bush is not the same as the man after the burning bush? Because before the burning bush, he was tending, well, first of all, he was raised by the daughter of Pharaoh, and he was tending the flock of the priest of Midian. And then after the burning bush, he's clearly a man that stood on holy ground and was given a task by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yes, and a little bit no, because what happened at the burning bush is that the Moses that had come about as a result of the 40 years that he was in the desert. And I have no doubt that he was prepared in the desert for the work that he was to do, and therefore already had the Spirit in him before this happened. This differs from Paul, who did not have the Spirit in him and was confronted by the same being in the same way with an audible voice. And he went through the process of being blinded by what he saw.
And was in fact baptized and received the throught, that we read explicitly. I know I'm supposed to know this, but the priest of Midian, his father-in-law, what does that mean, priest of Midian?
Well, it means that he was the priest who presided in Midian.
So was that a priest, or do we know?
I really doubt, because in the encounters between Moses and Jethro, it becomes obvious that Jethro also lords the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I wonder if he wasn't already a priest to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob even before that. Because how could his title be Reuel? His name was Jethro, and yet he was called Reuel by the people, which means that he was a friend of God. The 7th daughters of the priest of Midian came to draw water. They had filled the troughs to water their father's sheep when the shepherds came and tried to drive them away. But Moshe got up and defended them. Then he watered their sheep. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How come you're back so soon today?" And then the whole thing continues as we know. And now let me just show you this name, Reuel. Reuel, the name of Moses' father-in-law, friend of God, friend of El. And then when he comes and he gives his advice to Moses, it's quite obvious that he is speaking out of the Lord's mouth. And therefore, I am convinced that he was a very holy man as well. God said further to Moshe, "Say to the people of Israel, Yudevave Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I'm to be remembered generation after generation. Go, gather the leaders of Israel together and say to them, Adonai, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, has appeared to me and said, I have been paying close attention to you and have seen what is being done to you in Egypt. And I have said that I will lead you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, Hittite, Emori, Perizi, Hivi, and Yevusi, to a land flowing with milk and honey. So again, God repeats who he is. So for a second time, he says who he is, and then he says it with naming 3 names. 3 names is with great emphasis, and saying it twice is actually saying it with emphasis. So if you start looking at this from an interesting point of view, saying 3 things twice actually makes the number of man, and that means that God is addressing man, his portion of man, which is Israel, in the process, through Moses. And he's saying to them, go get the leaders and tell them that this Adonai, this Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Elohim of your fathers, has appeared, and he says, I want to take you out of your misery. And therefore, this is a very amazing happening that took place here. So there is this identification with the name. And my question is, if God comes and he says, I am Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and Yeshua says, I have revealed my name, your name to them, then why does it need to be concealed? It means that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh should, as far as scripture is concerned, be on our lips, But it is for fear of blasphemy that Israel has removed it. And therefore we're not sure of how it should be pronounced, because the first Yud-Hey is clear, that is Yah. But how the second Vav-Hey is to be pronounced is not that clear. Because the Vav can be either a vowel or a consonant. If it is a vowel, it is an O or a U sound. If it is a consonant, then it is a V or a W sound. So it is a soft W or a V sound. And the question is, why was it ever concealed? Because Yeshua revealed it to his disciples and says that the unity of his disciples is in the name. And then God gives his title Elohim, which is God, and he says he is the God specifically of Abram, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And of all three of them, it can be said that they heard the voice, obeyed it, and it was counted to them as righteousness. So Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, Elohim takes note of their condition and talks through their leaders, planning to save them. 40 years in the desert in Elohim's presence. Elohim, or God, always deals with sin and unrighteousness. And this means he can only deal with sin and unrighteousness in terms of the cross, in terms of Yeshua's execution. That means that also Moses had to go through the process of dying to his own sin and being resurrected to new life by the Spirit or the voice that is in him. Saving from slavery is saving out of sin and unrighteousness, because sin is the reason for all suffering. And as a comfort, there is the promise of the land. Yeshua says that he says what the Father says only, and that he only did what the Father had done. And for this reason, he's asking of Moses to do what he had heard the Spirit say and seen the Father do with his spiritual eyes. Then he says to Moses, they will heed what you say. Then you will come, you and the leaders of Israel, before the king of Egypt, and you will tell him, Adonai, Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, the Elohim of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert so that we can sacrifice to Adonai, our Elohim. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you leave unless he is forced to do so, but I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will do there. After that, he will let you go. Moreover, I will make the Egyptians so well disposed to this people that when you go, you won't go empty-handed. Rather, all the women will ask their neighbors and house guests for silver and gold jewelry and clothing with which you will dress your own sons and daughters, and in this way you will plunder Egypt. So there's always meaning to everything that happens. 3 days' journey. 3 days' journey is a common thing in Scripture. 3 days also is the journey between the death and the resurrection of the Messiah. There is this command that they should go and sacrifice. Sacrificing animals and the sacrifices to Yud-Hey Vav-Hey have a very specific meaning. When one brings a sacrifice, you put your hand on the head of the animal and you plead your sins over that animal. That animal then has your sins on it, and it becomes as though it is you. And you then slaughter it, and it dies in your place. The sacrificial animals have two things about it. The first is that they actually illustrate the sacrifice of the lamb, the sacrifice of the goat, who was Yeshua, dying for all sin so that we can be resurrected to new life. But also to the fact that Paul or Shaul alludes to, that we must make our bodies living sacrifices, that we need to die to our flesh and to our sinful nature and be resurrected to new life, to Elohim, to Adonai Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, our Elohim. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you leave until he's forced to do so. So he will not want Israel to put themselves into a good position with the father, and that he therefore will refuse that they go and sort themselves out. But in the final analysis, when Israel leaves the land, they will plunder the Egyptians and take very much to do. Elohim plans to affect Pharaoh and Egypt extremely badly and plunder it. And he rewards Israel for their suffering by taking plunder from the Egyptians. You know the whole story, and I'm not actually wanting to tell the story of the Exodus of Egypt. I'm wanting to show you this man, Moses. And you know all of Moses, about Moses coming and Moses asking that they go and sacrifice in the desert. You know all about the plagues. You all know all about the death of the firstborn. You know all about the Passover and what happened there. But all of this took place in terms of Moses heard the voice of the Father. He obeyed it, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Because what he went to do in Egypt, he certainly heard on an ongoing basis, because the Lord must have spoken to him on an ongoing basis, saying, no, I'm going to do this, now I'm going to do this, and actually mentioning the plagues one by one as they were going to do that. And then in the final analysis, telling Israel that they were to sacrifice the lamb that points to Yeshua, the Messiah, who is sacrificed as a fellowship sacrifice and also as an atonement sacrifice as a goat. Israel fears for their life, but Moses sees the Yeshua of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the Egyptians do not see eternity. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up. Now what had happened now is Israel as a nation had moved around the large horn of the Red Sea and had moved south into the area between the two horns of the Red Sea. And then Egypt, the Pharaoh, came after them. And you will understand their dilemma, because there was nowhere that they could go, because they were in this fork of the Red Sea, so as to speak. And then in that situation, obviously the Egyptians thought that this was the end. And then Moses heard the voice again. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and saw the Egyptians right there, coming after them. And in great fear, the people of Israel called out to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and said to Moshe, was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out to die in the desert? Why have you done this, bringing us up out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you in Egypt to let us alone? We'll just go on being slaves for the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to be the Egyptian slaves than to die in the desert. Interestingly, although they had experienced what they had experienced with the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, that still was not good enough for them. And they still thought that this was Moses leading them out, and could not yet see that it was Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh leading them out under the auspices of Moses. Now they say, why must we die in the desert? And they complain to Moses, but they call to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and they cry to Moshe and accuse him. Moses does not defend himself. Moshe answered the people, stop being so fearful. Remain steady and you will see how Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is going to save you. He will do it today. Today you have seen the Egyptians, but you will never see them again. And then he says, today you will see how Adonai is going to save you. The physical words here, and if you want to, I will put these words up. But this word, it actually says you will see the salvation of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So that is, you will see the Yeshua, and the Hebrew word used in the Old Testament is you will see the Yeshua of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And he also said that they would not see the Egyptians in all eternity, so that they would practically condemn to be with Satan. Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down. Yudevave asked Moshe, why are you crying to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift your staff, lift out with your hand over the sea, and divide it in two. The people of Israel would advance into the sea on dry ground. As for me, I will make the Egyptians hard-hearted, and they will march in after them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all his army, chariots and cavalry. When the Egyptians will realize that I am Yudevave, when I have won myself the glory at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his cavalry. Moses is told to lift up his staff. Moses' staff is an interesting phenomenon. The first time we read about Moses' staff is when Moses is told to throw his staff on the ground at the burning bush. He does so and it turns into a snake. We need to understand that the staff of ancient people was carefully carved with the history of the person whose staff it was. Therefore, Moses' staff was carved with 80 years of history. And he throws this staff, which actually represents his character, onto the ground, and it becomes a snake. He catches it and he is told to take it by the tail, which is the most dangerous thing to do to a snake. He does it. He grabs his character by its tail and it turns into a staff again. Thereafter, he shows this to Aaron once, and it is Aaron that throws down his staff because something had changed in Moses' staff. No longer was his character that of a snake, but his character was solid. At the Red Sea, the Father says, lift up your staff, lift up your sinlessness and your righteousness over the sea. The sinlessness and righteousness that I gave you in terms of the Ruach that is in you, in terms of Yeshua's execution, who heard the voice of the Spirit, obeyed it, and was counted to him as righteousness, divided, and then he will give the outcome. So Moses hears the voice, and in this instance, he has to trust, because he has to trust that when he lifts up the staff, it will be something will change in the physical dimension, because no longer is it something in him that is going to change, but something outside of him. Next, the angel of Elohim was going ahead of the camp of Israel, moved away and went behind them. And the column of cloud moved away from in front of them and stood behind them. It stationed itself between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. There was cloud and darkness there, but light by night there, so that no one did not come near the other all night long. Moshe reached his hand out of this, over the sea, and Yudevave caused the sea to go back before a strong east wind all night. He made the sea become dry land, and its water was divided in two. Then the people of Israel went into the sea on dry ground, with the water walled up for them on their right and on their left. So again, here is the angel of Elohim, Yeshua himself. So the leader of whatever Yudhevaveh does always is Yeshua, whether it is before his physical appearance or after it. And he moves in between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And he does something that comes from creation. He shows darkness towards the Egyptians. So the Egyptians see Satan. And he shows light towards Israel. And the Israelites see Yeshua. And he reached his hand out over the sea, and then the sea is divided in front of them. The Egyptians continued their pursuit, going after them into the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. I would have said that I have a military background, so I think that this was really bad info, and this was bad strategy and planning and tactics, because how would that water remain standing if it stood for the Israelites? Just before dawn, Yudhevaveh looked out on the Egyptian army through the column of fire and cloud and threw them into a panic. So they're in panic inside the sea because they suddenly realize what they've done. He caused the wheels of their chariots to break off so that they could move only with difficulty. The Egyptians said, Yudhevaveh is fighting for Israel against the Egyptians. Let's get away from them. Adonai said to Moshe, reach your hand out over the sea, and the water will turn and cover the Egyptians with their chariots and cavalry. Moshe reached his hand out over the sea, and by dawn, the sea had returned to its former depth. The Egyptians tried to flee, but Adonai swept them into the sea. So the angel of Elohim against Yeshua breaks the chariots. And Moses, through his obedience, because God said to him, Yudhevaveh said to Moshe, he didn't appear, reach your hand out over the sea. And the sea was closed and the army destroyed. The water came back and covered all the chariots and cavalry of Pharaoh's army who had followed them into the sea. Not even one of them was left. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the sea, but with the water walled up for them on their right and on their left. On that day, Yudhevaveh saved Israel from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore. When Israel saw the mighty deed that Yudhevaveh had performed against the Egyptians, the people feared Yudhevaveh, and they believed in Yudhevaveh and in his servant Moshe. So, happily, now at last, they're starting to believe this Moshe who had brought them up out of Egypt. But note something. Moses did not defend himself when they accused him that he had brought them out to die in the desert. And who defended Moses was Yudhevaveh. And this was to be a pattern. This was the pattern of what happened when Korach came. It is the pattern with Datan and Abiram. It is the pattern with Miriam and Aaron. Each time it was Yudhevaveh who defended this man, Moses. And the Hebrew interpretation of what meekness is, because the Hebrew Moses is called the meekest of all men who lived, along with Yeshua also was the meekest of all men who lived. But he led 600,000 Jews out of Egypt, and you saw what trouble he had in the process. That doesn't mean that Moses was a pushover. So it does not mean that Moses was a weak man. He was a very, very strong man, but he did not defend himself. And in that way, he was meek. He did not attack back when people attacked him. And he allowed the Lord to protect him. Moses' obedience closed the sea and the army was destroyed. Once again, he heard the voice, he obeyed it. It was counted to him as righteousness, and the Lord did what he had promised to do.
I realized something for the first time, and that is the fact that Elohim made the Egyptians see the darkness while the Israelites saw the light. In our world today, war, hate, rage, corruption, all happens when somebody sees darkness in front of them, not the light. It was in fact necessary for Abba to hide the light from the Egyptians because they would have lost their hate and stopped their warlike pursuit had they seen the light. The light being Yeshua, of course. And I'm reading this on my phone as we're talking. Abba quite literally hid the light from them so that they could continue their pursuit.
Yes.
And the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. So it was darkness to the Egyptians and light to the Israelites. So the Israelites could live in peace and belief and not fear and anger. And the Egyptians had hate and pursuit and anger in them because all that they saw was darkness.
But the light is right there in the scriptures.
Yes, but we just read over it, man.
They're in the desert, so they sort of forgot now about the parting of the Red Sea. There in the desert, the whole community of the people of Israel grumbled against Moshe and Aaron. The people of Israel said to them, "We wish Yudevave had used his own hand to kill us off in Egypt. There we used to sit around the pots with the meat boiling, and we had as much food as we wanted. But you have taken us out into this desert and let this whole assembly starve to death." Adonai said to Moses, "Here, I will cause bread to rain down from heaven for you. The people are to go out and gather a day's ration every day. By this I will test whether they will observe my Torah or not." He's saying, "I'll feed them." And Moses does not defend. He talks to Yudevave. Yudevave promises the manna. Moshe and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "This evening you will realize that it has been Adonai, Yudevave, who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see Yudevave's glory, for he has listened to your grumblings against Yudevave. What are we that you should grumble against us?" So here Moses is saying, the one who led you out and brought you here, brought you through the sea, is not me. I am not a miracle maker. And you're acting towards me as though I am the miracle maker who brought you here. I am not that miracle maker. Don't grumble against us. Moshe ended, what I have said will happen when Yudevave gives you meat to eat this evening and you feed of bread tomorrow morning. Yudevave has listened to your complaints and grumblings against him. What are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against Yudevave. He calls it Yudevave's business, and he places Israel in Yudevave's hands. So this will be one of the most important characteristics of anyone who comes up as a leader under these circumstances, because it is going to be very dangerous. And that person will come up against exactly the same stuff from the Christians. That evening, quails came up and covered the camp, while in the morning there was a layer of dew all around. When the dew had evaporated, there on the surface of the desert was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they asked each other, "Manu, what is it?" Because they did not know what it was. Moshe answered them, "It is the bread which Yudevave has given you to eat. Here is what Yudevave has ordered. Each man is to gather according to his appetite. Each is to take an omer per person for everyone in his tent." The quails came up, covered the camp, and then there came the manna in the morning. And he said that everyone is to take enough. And here is the first instance where Yudevave provides the daily bread. And therefore, when Yeshua prays for our daily bread, he is praying that we will be provided with spiritual bread and also with physical bread. So Israel murmurs, Yudevave provides, and Moshe goes into the background. He just says, "Here's the bread. You asked for it. Here's your bread. And you also know of the whole issue with the quails when they were complaining too much. They were sent an excess of quails and that the quails started rotting. The plague that came over them as a result of that. But that is not really so much about who is this person, Moses. This person, Moses, hears the complaints, he takes the complaints to God, God answers, and he doesn't defend himself. Then the whole community of the people of Israel left the Sin desert, traveling in stages as Judah had ordered, and camped at Rephidim. There was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moshe, demanding, "Give us water to drink." But Moshe replied, "Why pick a fight with me? Why are you testing Judah? What is the pattern? Moshe is attacked. He doesn't defend himself. And now the question is, how is God going to defend Moshe and provide for Israel? Because Moshe had 40 years of practice, and Israel was now on its way to get 40 years of practice that actually was unnecessary. Exodus 17, verse 5 to 7. Adonai answered Moshe, "Go on ahead of the people and bring with you the leaders of Israel. Take your staff in your hand, the one you used to strike the river, and go. I will stand in front of you there on the rock in Horeb. You are to strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people can drink." Moshe did this in the sight of the leaders of Israel. The place was named Massah, testing, and Meribah, quarreling, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested Judah by asking, "Is Judah with us or not?" So Israel demands water. Comes to Moses, he hears the voice, and Judah refers to Moshe refers to Judah. Never does it himself. Take the staff at Meribah again. Take the staff, assemble the community, you and Aaron, your brother, and before their eyes, tell the rock to produce its water. You will bring them water out of the rock, and thus enable the community and their livestock to drink. Moshe took the staff from the presence of Judah as he had ordered him. So Moses takes his character from the presence of Judah. But after Moshe and Aaron had assembled the community in front of the rock, he said to them, "Listen here, you rebels. Are we supposed to bring you water from this rock?" So now for the first time, Moses is really fed up and angry. And then Moses raised his hand and hit the rock twice with his staff. He did what he had done the previous time. Water flowed out in abundance, and the community and their livestock drank. But Moses did not enter the land because he had heard the voice and had refused to obey it. Who knows? If Moses had heard the voice, obeyed it, it would have been counted to him as righteousness, and he would have entered the land and would still have been in the land because he would have had eternal life. You see what Moshe did here is he listened to the other voice, the voice that said, "What's in it for you?" And the minute it became about Moses, it is said that the minute that anyone is dealing with himself, when it is about himself, then he is eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Moses eats of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, hits the rock, and out comes the water. So not strike the rock, and not we provide the water. We, which is Moses and Aaron. Tragic. But this mistake, which I think all of us will agree was a small mistake by comparison, ended up with Moses dying and Satan fighting about his body.
I'd love to ask you, why would the Israelites quarrel against Moshe, yet Moshe has got the mandate from God? I want to bring it home. We see people, they always quarrel. They always have this problem with their leader, especially people who God has given them a mandate like Moses. How does that happen? Because Moses has been called by God, and then he has to take the Israelites out of Egypt and lead them to the promised land. So now, how do the people not, let me say, respect the leadership of Moses or a person like Moses?
When the Lord starts speaking on the mountain, the nation of Israel says to him, tell Yudevave to speak to you, and then you speak to us. So that means that who will be speaking to the people of Israel? Because they were meant to hear the voice of God himself. Now they're saying to Yudevave, shut up, speak to Moses. Because if you say speak to Moses, don't speak to us, you're saying to him, shut up. And then which voice are you going to hear? Because we are afraid. So it is about us wanting. And the minute it is about us, we're eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The difference is in the spiritual level of the people and the spiritual level of Moses. The people were supposed to have seen the spiritual level of Moses and should have sought to have the spiritual level of Moses for themselves. When Paul starts speaking, he says that we should pray continuously. Prayer is not just us talking to God, it's also God talking to us. And the only part of that discussion that is worth anything is God talking to us. So if we are to pray continuously, I think all of us would agree, we should be listening to God and we should be hearing his voice at all times. So if we are to hear his voice at all times, we are to make very sure that it is not about us. The minute it is about us, if we want health, if we want prosperity, if we want peace, if we want a good country, what do we want? It's what we want. The question is not what we want. The question is what he wants. And he will provide people, because I don't believe that this can happen with a single person for South Africa at all. He will provide people to lead this nation, to hear the voice and obey it, for it to be counted to them as righteousness. Because then he will do his miracles through his nation.
This verse about striking the rock twice is for me so amazing because it says a lot about the character of the God that we serve. We understand now that Moses was at that point listening to the adversary, not to the voice of God. And after he struck the rock the first time, nothing happened. He had the opportunity to say, I'm making a mistake, and to repent, and he could have spoken to the rock, but he was so mad that he strikes the rock the second time. And see what Adonai does. Even though if it were me, I would have said, no, you're not doing what I told you. I'm not going to give you what you asked. That's not the character of our Creator. He actually, you could almost say, goes against his own word and gives the water. And the only person that suffers because of the not listening is Moses, not the whole nation.
Yes.
There is, of course, also the truth that if after striking the second time water did not spring forth, it would have destroyed Moses' ability to lead the nation. Because he would have stood there red-faced saying, oh, I didn't listen, So what Abba did there with that little word twice, to me is so amazing and tells me so much about his character. But in the end, if we don't listen, there are consequences.
But Yudevave said to Moshe, that's verse 12, and Aaron, because you did not trust in me so as to cause me to be regarded as holy by the people of Israel, you will not bring this community into the land I have given them. This is Meribah spring, disputation spring, where the people of Israel disputed with Yudevave, and he was caused to be regarded as holy by them. So Moses takes honor for water. He ignores the rock, strikes it twice, and whereas he was sent to bring Israel into the land, he cannot do it anymore.